Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of the HR Evolution or Revolution, whatever way that you look at it. Bobby and I are here today with Igor, our distinguished guest of this afternoon, to really learn from best in breed, best in class professionals that are really leading the profession forward. Today we learn from conversations, but also best practices. And also it's important to bring in the psychoanalysis portion of it. So we wanted to bring on Igor, a specialist in the field in that regard, because at the end of the day, we are all people. And the more we understand people and how they're making decisions, the better we are to build the culture that they want and are looking for. So I'm Kevin Rustici and my co-host, Bobby Spaziani.
Thanks, Kevin. Appreciate it. And like you said, we continue our passion project on our HRevolution podcast here. I think a little bit of a different lens today, right? I mean, I think we talk a lot about, folks that are in the HR, in the business, right? Doing the work today within organizations. Igor comes to us from the academic side of things. So excited to dive into it, Igor, with you today.
Well, let me properly introduce Igor Menezes. He is a organizational behavior as well as human capital management or human people analytics lecturer, but also now professor over at Hull University. So welcome to the show, Igor.
I'm very well, thanks. Thanks for having me here.
It's an absolute pleasure. Well, I'm going to start with something not maybe in your wheelhouse because it's something that you do every day. But what did you have for breakfast this morning, Igor?
So just the basics. So just fruits and yogurt. So very healthy breakfast. Yeah.
That's how you start your morning. I love it.
Yeah.
Igor, I have one for you as well. So, obviously I'm looking at all your publications, all your research that you've done. It's absolutely incredible. I don't know when you get free time just looking at what you've done, but when you do get some free time, what do you enjoy doing for yourself?
Mostly stay with my wife and also play my guitar and study a few things. Also watch TV series, Netflix, just the basics. So I'm a quite regular guy, so nothing extraordinary, something like climbing mountains or anything like this. So very basic.
No skydiving, none of that.
No skydiving, anything like this. No.
Well, I gotta ask because I'm a recovering Netflix junkie myself, Igor. And what's the series that you're watching right now? What's consuming your weekends?
The last week I just gave it a go at Squid Game.
Oh, I watched that.
I didn't quite enjoy it. So I thought it was very similar to all the TV series that I watched in the past. Something like a mix of Black Mirror with all the TV series. And I said, no, that's too much. I want something more funny. So I don't want this bloody moves. So just want something to enjoy myself.
Comedy, Dave Chappelle's last stand-up is amazing. So
that's good to know. Yeah,
he's one of my favorite comedians of all time. He's amazing. Well, you must love the mental games then of Squid Games there, and kind of just changing gears here a little bit. We want to understand really about your passion project yourself. We talked about this being our passion project, about the revolution of HR for the evolution of business, but you talked about kind of giving a taste of predicting future performance or predicting things for both individuals and businesses. And once you got that bite, you wanted more. Can you kind of talk about how you got into this field and why you found your passion in this field to really make a difference?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that'd be a long story, actually. So everything started about 20 years ago when I came across the field of organizational psychology. And then I started to work with statistics applied to organizational psychology. And when I came across psychometrics, actually, what was, I would say, I totally opened my mind to a new field, to a new experience. And it was something totally different from my experience as an undergraduate student at that point. Because most of my undergrad was based on psychoanalysis, as you mentioned, it's psychoanalysis and clinical psychology and all of this stuff. And then I said, okay, there's something here which is different from the rest. And I should take more time to study these things. And that's when I decided to study more psychometrics. And alongside organizational psychology, start to see that we could work with people data. At the point, we wouldn't call it people data. So that's something totally new that came after HR. So we don't call people data. But at the point I saw, okay, that's interesting to learn more about organizational commitment, organizational citizenship, and how the things, for example, could make an impact to the organization. And then that's when, about 20 years ago, I started to work with organizational psychology alongside psychometrics and see the potential that these tools could have to understand more about human behaviors. And then after a while, after I would say about 6 years ago, 7 years ago, the first time when I came to the University of Cambridge to study my postdoctoral and carry out my postdoctoral studies, that's when I came across this new field of HR analytics. And then I started to see, okay, that's something that I have done for a long time. I didn't know that I was doing this, actually. So that's, if I combine organizational psychology with psychometrics, with HR practices, with this, and that, actually, if I put this all together, that's actually HR analytics, that's people analytics. Mm-hmm. And that's why when I decided to basically say, okay, I'm going to study people analytics and try to really invest on this field and trying to make this a scientific field, because my main concern now is actually how to make people analytics a scientifically based area instead of just industry focused area.
That's excellent. And so a simple-minded person like myself, Igor, could you break down kind of the idea of psychometrics, predictive psychometrics? What is it? You know, how is it? How does it fall into this larger umbrella of people analytics?
Excellent. Yeah, that's a good question. So I think everything relates to what we discussed in terms of explanatory models versus predictive models. So we need to understand the nature of these investigations so as we can really tap into what each of these fields could really bring in terms of contributions. So, but when you work with explanatory models, so we basically look into the past, into the data that we collected to try to understand more the relations between variables. So what associations we have in this data are formed based on this data. But what was actually to understand more in depth what the data is telling you. So you don't want to make predictions based on this data necessarily. So if you want to make predictions, you need to take this data and you need to have a new data set, a holdout data, something which doesn't necessarily need to be collected in the future, but something which is external to your current data set. So as you can compare your data against this new data. That's the predictive model, predictive explanation. But if you combine these two things, we finally have the field of analytics. So what is actually analytics? Analytics is this combination of different techniques. In the past, I would call it a triangulation, but I think it's more than a triangulation now. So we have many more dimensions. So we have a combination of qualitative data, quantitative data, explanatory models, predictive models. And at the end of the day, what we want is to combine different models so as we can get good results. We can improve business outcomes. And that's exactly what we do in analytics. So in terms of the combination of psychometrics, and psychometrics is mostly explanatory by nature. So if you take most of the models in psychometrics are much more explanatory. So they look into the data in the past, trying to map this data and trying to come up with new patterns so as we can see whether or not these items are really measuring what they intend to measure. But when it comes to predictions, even the predictive validity of our models, sometimes we're not talking about predictive validity. Sometimes it's actually just trying to make inferences about your data, so which is not necessarily predictions. So if you want to make a prediction, we need to have data that will be collected in the future, or even data that is not necessarily collected or evolved in the initial predictions that you made with your initial data set. So the idea of predictive psychometrics is combining these two things. Is take the data from the past, the current models that we have for modeling latent variables, and combining those with new predictive models, machine learning models, so as we can improve the accuracy in the prediction of human behaviors.
And human behaviors
interesting.
are it's so important to tap into, because at the end of the day, like I said initially, it's how you start to design a culture strategy, right? If you understand how people are making those decisions within their day, or what's having the greatest impact, those key pivotal life moments or events, is so important. One of the things that I wanted to talk to you about is because we're starting to see, I think, in the war for talent or the Great Resignation, that businesses are starting to become desperate to quickly analyze talent and identify if they're going to be a proper fit within their organization or not. I've seen businesses and HR departments and talent acquisition specialists really rely heavily on assessments. Now, the assessments that they typically are using, Igor, I think you and I would both agree, are not being used correctly for their initial intention, like DISC, like Myers-Briggs,
yes,
and Predictive Performance Index, but they're being sold to these people as such. What do you have to say about how they're being utilized, and really, I guess, the damaging effects of a company that's really putting all their weight into a DISC assessment or a Myers-Briggs assessment? What do you have to say, I guess, about the future of psychometric analysis and assessments moving forward?
I think the main problem is not the psychometric techniques per se. I think we psychometrics have evolved over the last 100 years to something which is quite advanced in terms of techniques. But even when sometimes you say that you are a psychometrician and use psychometric models, you've seen people say, or they just believe that you administer tests. So we just use these tests for making decisions about anything and everything, but it's not how it should be, because of course we have two things here. So the first point is that we should have valid models and valid theories. Actually, at the end of the day, there is a high reliance on theories. So we are very reliant on theories in psychometrics, because it's pointless if you have very advanced models in psychometrics, but if you have very poor theories. So everything boils down to the theoretical underpinnings of the model that you're using. So advanced theories will also provide with best instruments. Even if you use classical test theory, you don't use iter-response theory or multi-dimensional models, or models which are more advanced. So if you have good theories, you also have best instruments. That's one of the points. And the other thing is actually the teleological value of the test, which is the philosophical assumption that we have about the test. So what can I do with the results of my test? So I think that's the important part of it. In one of the most important points in people analytics, for example, because if you just use the psychometric test as a single tool without combining this with all the elements, all the variables and indicators in the organization, so that will be just, you create very poor predictive models. And at the same time, if you do the other way around, if you also just use KPIs, if you don't take into account psychometric models, psychometric variables, and latent variable models, you also create something which is not people analytics. It's actually business analytics or any other kind of analytics, but people analytics. So that's important to have these two aspects. And the other thing about the use of MBTI and DISC, I think I'm quite happy that you mentioned this too, because I think they are two of the most challenging assessments that we have, because they've been around for a long time, I think more than 60, 70 years or so, and people are still using these tools for making decisions, but they are type-based, so they are not advanced in terms of theory. So they have problems with validity, they have problems with predictive validity, and when it comes to trait-based theories, they're still quite limited in terms of applications. But do you know what? It's mostly because people want to know who they are. So there's always this idea that, oh, my type is AJS, and they start to combine these things. And they start to compare themselves with others and say, oh, I'm this type, what about yours? So what's your type? And they start to compare each other. So that's quite attractive. That's exactly what people want to know. They want to know who they are. But at the end of the day, there is some problems with the validity of these models, because they are not valid enough. So they don't have any, they're not carefully, or the data that's been collected and the way that the theory has been based is not theoretically sound. So that's one of the issues that we have.
Thank you for that.
Interesting. Yeah, and Igor, I got to ask, I think, prior to 2020, it was probably much easier to walk into organizations and get a, good understanding of how humans were interacting face to face. And we know that the pandemic has kind of, shifted our work today, right? We have, remote work, hybrid work, et cetera. How has this become a challenge, or how have you, pivoted in your work and in your, your research on human behavior going forward? And how do you plan on continuing to, research and evolve the area of human behavior going forward in this new environment?
That's a very good question. So I'm going to bring an example beforehand. So in the past, we collected data alongside a big company, database of more than 1 million people from several different companies. And one of the things that we came across, one of the results, the main results, the main takeaways, was that remote working was not having the investment that workers would like to. And that was in the past. And one of the challenges in terms of research is that some of the data that we collected in the past and some of the results became obsolete. So they're obsolete now. Mostly because we have a new reality, we have a new work setting, a new configuration that should be taken into account. And some of the data that we collected, of course, that would be very good if we could have a time series or a longitudinal data that would allow us to compare what was the perception of these workers at the moment and what's the perception now after having this widespread notion of remote working. So that would be great to have these comparisons in terms of models. I think that's one of the challenges. Some of the data that we collected pre-pandemic is not the same as post-pandemic era. So we need to reconfigure our data set and also the work settings. The way that work is organized has changed very quickly. So that's one of the challenges that we have in terms of research now. The other thing is also, I would say it's much more methodological, because in the past, we used to look into the data based on more unidimensional models or models that would provide you with very straightforward answers to your questions. And even when we take, for example, PhD studies, we see that some of this research is much more about moderation mediation effects involve a limited number of variables. But if you want to understand an organization, you need to understand an organization as a complex system, a system based on several different variables relating to one another and influence one another at the same time. And that's something that we haven't done so far. So we published a paper 2 weeks ago showing exactly how to model organizational climate based on a new perspective called psychological networks. And in psychological networks, what we do is actually to establish these relationships and show how each variable from different dimensions could influence one another. So it's very different from the common factor approach that we used in the past, in which if I want to understand organizational climates, I just need to collect data once a year. Of course, we have also post surveys among other, so there's some criticism around this. But if you want to collect data once a year, what organizations usually do is to show the descriptive statistics for each variable separately. So how much is this current leadership, benefits, etc., and so on. But how about the relationships between these things? So that's exactly what analytics is about. It's about relationships. It's about provide more insights into this reality. It's understanding organization as a complex system, not as dimensions investigated separately. So, but that's very complex. It was a challenge when we wrote this paper because there is no guideline so far on how to interpret a complex system. It's like chaos theory. So we have a theory which shows we have different elements and particles that are interacting, but how can we model this complexity? So modeling this complexity is something very, very challenging. So I don't know if I answered your question, but I think these are the challenges that we have in terms of research for the next decade or so.
And a lot of people have a lot more questions than answers, I think, right now too, is just like Bobby suggested, right? Is how do I find that balance and kind of tapping into the, I guess, the psychology behind it. What would you recommend organizations, like, again, the Great Resignation, you mentioned about the swift move to a work from home environment that was really forced. What is the mental psyche of the workforce today, Igor, in your opinion, in your estimation, and why are businesses challenged so much to I guess, understand what the people actually want?
Yeah, I think one of the things that we should investigate more in depth is actually the concept of Great Resignation. I've seen some a bit opposite views in terms of the Great Resignation, because there is one research that was done that says the Great Resignation is actually the number of jobs and people that were leaving the jobs in the middle of the pandemic, but they decided not doing so because it was not safe. They wouldn't get a new job. And that was a kind of backlog on these resignations. And now we have people really leaving their jobs because of this backlog. So that's one of the things. I think there might be a few people in a few jobs under this situation, this circumstance, but I think there is more to it. I think there's really something that changed. So even here in academia, even here at the university, we have this new hybrid approach. So we are working twice a week here, and the rest of the time we are basically working from home, mostly for environmental reasons. So we're a university which is environmentally friendly. So we want, of course, to cut carbon emissions. So for doing that, if you work from home, you can also contribute somehow with these emissions. So, but these things should be taken into account. And of course, that also shows that the workspace and organizations should adapt these new realities. So that's something that would play a different role in the future, and something that we need to adapt. So yeah, in terms of psychology, the important part of it, actually, something that was, I would say, overlooked for a long time, that was actually the employees' well-being. I think that's something that we in the past wouldn't discuss, but now we have much more discussion about the employees' well-being or employees' identity and meaning. So what's the meaning of work? That's something that we discussed since the 80s, but it was not in the agenda of the organizations. And now we've seen the discussions being much more, happening much more in a more strongly defined way. So in this case, I think it's important that we understand what's the meaning of work for you, for me, for Bob, for everyone. So what's exactly, why are you doing this? Why do we have this motivation of doing a podcast? It's not a traditional job. So it's not a 9-to-5 job, but you still have the headspace to do it, and you still have a motivation, enthusiasm for doing this. What about, I don't know, being an academic? So what's the main motivation? Is it the same, or is that something that has changed, for example? So how can we take all of these aspects and trying to reconfigure this so as we can provide a different experience for students, for example, or do research in a different way? Is it possible to do this in a different way? So these things are still, we haven't decided yet what to do with these things. So I think we are trying to do this along the way, but it's just very challenging in terms of how to reconfigure the work and how to think in a new organization of the work of the job as a whole. And there are more questions unanswered, I'm afraid, than clear answers to that.
Yeah. Well, Igor, just the meaning of work, Bobby and I jokingly talk about that. And that's something I can say in America is changed, right? Pre-pandemic, post-pandemic, the real meaning of work, I think in most lives has really officially changed. And I think we're gearing more towards like the UK European mindset, where a job is there to help like us live our life. and it's not our life anymore. The American obsession with the American dream, chasing the hierarchical structure to move up the ladder, is really different now, right? People thought they wanted that, and then I think they came to the realization during the pandemic that maybe that's not really what life is all about, and maybe they want to be home with their kid at 3 o'clock to get them off the bus. And that's when I say, like, the hard line stances that you're starting to see businesses take here, because they are frustrated. The amount of work to reconfigure work, they're seeing that it's too much, right? And they're trying to find the easy way, but they're drawing the hard line in the stance. From a psychologist perspective, can you explain to the audience how more detrimental that actually is to the business at the end of the day, meeting people where they are today?
Well, that's difficult in terms of psychology, because I think the theories in the past, and even some research that was conducted in the past, were able to bring some solutions at the point. But I don't know how much the new theories or the new aspects related to the work will really be addressed by this theory. So it seems to me that we have to rethink a few theories. We need to come up with new models, new solutions that will not be based on theoretical models only. So that's exactly the moment that psychology should shift towards something more data-driven as well. Of course, I'm not against theory-driven approach. That's exactly the opposite. So I'm always in favor of a combination between theory-driven and data-driven approach. I don't think that we should ignore all the theories that we have developed, but we can also stick to the old ways of doing research and just work with data and explanatory models, data that just look into the past based on small sample size, data collected with students in classrooms that would not have any inference or generalization power to the whole of the population. I'm very critical about these things, because I'm afraid that's not how it should be. And we've seen some publications, or many publications actually, at the end of the day doing this. So we need to be more involved with organizations, build more partnerships, create more relationships with people from different countries, different companies, and trying to bring these discussions into the companies, because the problem is that in psychology we usually tend to think very theoretically of models before think of solutions. So it's important that we try to understand the business problems, understand exactly what's happening out there, and then bring this into academia so as we can conduct research based on reality than just based on theoretical models. But of course, I'm not criticizing my colleagues or anything like this. It's just, I think it's something that we have done for a long time in psychology. And I just believe that we should, at this point, try just to reflect our practices and trying to bring something which is really academia. I think industry is doing something which is disruptive, but the academic models are still not reflecting exactly the reality, how it looks like.
And that's the same. I mean, Bobby and I are in the same passion project to reinvent HR, because HR has typically been the administrative, tactical, no police, right, within organizations, and just the compliance side of it. Bobby, what did you have?
Yeah, I just kind of wanted to touch back on something that you mentioned earlier, Igor. We talked about the inputs that kind of create and make up HR analytics or people analytics. And just from your perspective in studying different organizations and seeing organizations that do people analytics, and for our audience, I did that in air quotes, right? Because I think everybody says that they have people analytics or HR analytics, and some companies have even built out departments to show that. But we know that some do it right and some don't do it so right. So from your experience, what are the good companies doing as it relates to people analytics?
Yeah, I'm glad that you touched on this point, because what I'm seeing is that some of the companies, and actually there is any statistics about this. So what they usually say is that 40% of the companies that says that use AI And people analytics, they don't actually have any solution that uses machine learning models or analytics or anything. So that, which is quite stunning. So I think that's, it depends on the company, of course, because a few companies believe that to have people analytics implemented is something very expensive. I would say it's not very expensive. You could have start just one person, one analyst, an HR analyst that has very good training and some techniques that would bring new ideas to the organization, which at the end of the day, we should define correctly what analytics is. So if you just do descriptive statistics, if you just use Excel, can we consider this as people analytics? I don't know, a few organizations would say, yes, we are doing people analytics, because that could be enough to resolve the problems. So if you have a very small company with 10 employees or so, and you believe that mapping this data or doing qualitative research would answer the questions, okay, that's fine, you're doing analytics for your organization. In my view, I think analytics is much more about the combination of different elements. And these elements are not only about people, elements about also the organization, financial aspects, marketing, clients. So it should have this combination, otherwise you're not doing people analytics. But of course, the other thing about people analytics is the implementation of people analytics in terms of the aims of your project. So for example, if you just want to create very nice dashboards and visualizations that would provide with descriptive models, okay, you're doing analytics, and that's exactly most of the companies do when they say that they work with people analytics. So it's all about bring data in and just show all these nice visuals and say, okay, let's just split the data set. Here you see, let's compare this group with this group, and then there's the difference between these two groups, etc. They don't even calculate whether or not the difference is significant. So exactly. It's just to say,
or if there's even a correlation between them.
Or that's even a correlation. So that's just, they say, okay, that's the data. Yeah. So I've seen some people, for example, some organizations just taking correlations and turn this into frequencies. And say, okay, that's the frequency. So, but correlation is not frequencies. So we can simply directly translate this into frequencies. Or they're just comparing or creating some visualizations which would look at the difference or show a difference, which is very small, look very large, just because they change the scale of the plot. And they just say, oh, that's the difference between this group and this group, because what they want to trying to convey the idea is that there is a difference when there isn't. So that's something that also I saw. So that's not the best practices in people analytics, of course. So that would be some of the worst practices. But a good people analytics organization or department in an organization would combine, it would be very careful of dealing with people data in a way that would consider, I would say, latent variable models that would create instruments which are valid. They would be careful about the use of explanatory models. They would try to make sure that all of the models, all of the items are really valid. They would take this and combine it with predictive models. So there is a combination between explanatory and predictive models. And finally, they would come up with nice visualizations that would really reflect what they intend to convey. I think that's exactly what a good people analytics practice or best practice in people analytics would look like. But of course, as I said before, in this case, that's not cheap. So that's very expensive, because you have to collect data from different parts of the organization. You have to integrate this data, which sometimes is based on different platforms that don't communicate with one another. So they don't talk to each other, and they're just totally independent. I had this problem once working with a hospital, for example. I was trying to show the data on some clients, I would say clients or patients. And what the hospital would like to do was to connect the data from the clients with the doctor team. But the data was in different platforms. I couldn't say, for example, how much the satisfaction of the client was impacted by the way that they were solved by the team. So there are two different platforms. If there are two different platforms, we have a sparse matrix. So we don't have this data that don't match. If they don't match, we can simply make any inferences. And then it was quite hard, of course. If you find a way of integrating this, you can provide some insights into it. But otherwise, you just have data which would be used on the descriptive approach rather than a predictive approach.
Yeah, and I love the piece too, because data without insights is just numbers on a page, like you just said, right? So I think there's almost like a journey in people analytics strategies, and getting that single source of truth first is one of the biggest hurdles. One of the other things that I've noticed in the people analytics space is there's statisticians and there's people that are great with analytics, right? But they still do not know what business questions and what human questions to ask of that data, right? And that's really where the money is, right? That's where you're making the difference. Now, they can run any correlation that you can dream of, but you have to think of that, what correlation would even be representative of what's actually going on or what you think. So I think the challenge is actually designing the hypothesis for a lot of organizations, right? What do you typically, when you're teaching your students, when you're teaching businesses to come up with a hypothesis to then test with analytics and data, how do you help them formulate that particular hypothesis from a psychology standpoint or side?
Yeah, it always starts with a roadmap. So we have to create a roadmap for including the whole process that you want to find. So it always starts with talking to people. So we have to talk to people in the organization to find what the problem is. So what's the issue is? Because sometimes we don't have an issue, but we want to enhance a few things. So I've seen a few people say, oh, everything starts from a problem. So sometimes we don't have a big problem, but what you want to do is to improve it, to maximize the potential of some applications, of some variables. And that's exactly where you should start off. So you have to start by speaking with people. Could be an interview, could be using a qualitative approach, could be anything that's more informal, for example. But you need to understand exactly what the business problem is before formulating any hypothesis. Because before formulating hypothesis, you should have questions about what you really want to investigate. So the first thing is trying to find what the indicators you want to focus on. So what variables are included in this problem? The second thing is also that I always talk to my students that it's all about feasibility. If you don't have time, if you don't have money, if you don't have resources, so how can you collect data? How can you analyze the data? You can't. So it's important that you always try to see the feasibility of your project, of your roadmap. So the simpler, the better. That's what I usually say. Start basic, start very, very simple. And then you can move on with more predictive models. And when it comes to formulating hypotheses after having questions, for example, it's important that you always follow suit. I mean, it's important that the questions are simple and the hypotheses that follow are also simple. So it could be a bidirectional model, could be just your hypothesis in the model. It's simple, yes, it's limited, totally, but it's still feasible. So it's important that you try to make your problem look as simple as possible. Why? Because at the end of the day, it's very simple to create a regression model or just do some correlation, something that would get off the ground. So that's exactly what you need. And what you need to do is to convince the people that you are doing something scientifically grounded. That's what's important. It's not something based on gut feeling. So why reformulate this hypothesis? Because I have some questions which are based on some theories, and I can follow these theories to formulate my questions and finally to formulate my hypothesis. And what about, should I include more variables? Of course you can include more variables. You can conduct a moderation mediation study, create a structural equation modeling, or do anything you want. But you need also to make sure that those who will buy your project, I mean, those in the organization that will try to understand your project, they really understand it, because you don't want to waste your time doing so much data analysis and things which are very complex and high level, and people will not understand exactly what you're talking about. So that's important that you also communicate and you also convey this information in a way that's very simple, so as everyone can understand.
Yeah. And
of course, after delivering this first hypothesis and trying to test this, you can escalate this and you can just try to make this more complex and add new variables. You can add variables in, for example, use a psychological network analysis, which is something very, very simple in practice to do, because it's also based on correlation models. So you can investigate this based on correlations. You can check all the variables that could potentially influence your model, your system. After that, you can start to make predictions. But of course, predictions should also be justified, because predictions are made because you want to intervene in some aspect in the future. So why do you want to know that tomorrow will rain or not? So you want to do something with this. So you want to take this information and make this something which is really helpful, something that would be useful for the organization.
And I think those are the best relationships, when you know how to communicate and know who you're dealing with. And that's probably why engagement rates have only hovered around 30 to 33% over the last 15 years, right? Is like the internal relationships, those intangibles, are more important to the overall success of people analytics and HR, frankly. So if finance is not on board and doesn't understand, they're going to fall into the 78% of people that are using their gut instinct and intuition to drive business decisions, or trust their rear view mirror looking at the profit and loss statement to drive business decisions. And we know that's catastrophic, and really showing how catastrophic it is during times of turmoil and times of stress. Where we are right now. And that's really, we talk about when only 22% of businesses leverage data and science to make business decisions. Igor, that is like saying that your whole field of study is irrelevant and doesn't exist, right? It's pretty much what 78% of people are saying. Oh, I know more than an organizational psychologist about the relationships of how I'm supposed to lead and get others to follow. The last question that Bobby and I typically love to ask is, in your estimation, where is the future of work headed?
I think the future of work is headed towards something which would be a hybrid model. In terms of workplace, I think we will see a growth in terms of hybrid models. I've seen some companies around the world now finally offering remote work instead of only based on some specific locations, and that would play an important role in diversifying the workforce. So we have more people from different regions with different ideas, making companies much more diverse, and the feeling of psychological safety, among other things, trust, other things, will also improve as a result. I think that's one of the things that we'll see over the next couple of years. We'll see more collaboration between companies, even competing companies. So I think we also see more collaboration, because we realize that by collaborating, you can also have best techniques. You can advance your vision in a much better way than if you just work on your own. I think that's the second thing. So we have a much more open source based platform now of discussions, and we've seen it's not like the past that we used to have industrial secrets and things that should be kept under 7 layers and things like this. Now what we have is much more, let's try to share this information, because when you share, you know exactly that others could contribute to your project, contribute ideas, and at the end of the day you can grow much faster than, for example, just having or working independently. So I think that's the other thing that we'll also see. And the third point is actually, I think it's in terms of focus more on employee well-being. As I said before, I think now we have a different way of looking to the workforce. Now you have to be more attractive as a company to keep people, not only to hire, but to keep people, to make people attracted, to make people want to stay in the organization. And of course, for all of these things, we need people analytics. We need to have good predictive models. We need to understand why people would like to stay, why people would like to leave. We have a generational aspect as well, of course. We know that this new generation is much more likely to leave the organizations and to work for more companies along the lives, over the lifespan. But I think that's something we should also consider. Consider that they would be leaving in any case. How can we provide them with the best experience, and how can we tap into their skills and use the best opportunities that they can provide us with? I think that's the things that companies now need to realize. So there is a shift in terms of understanding of the workforce that will play an important role for the new job market.
Love that. And getting by with a little help of your friends, we know even if Coca-Cola copied exactly everything that Pepsi is doing today, that still they would not have the same financials at the end of the year. So that's why it's like almost getting over those hidden things that they thought were proprietary before. What we're finding is that your people are more proprietary, and that intellectual capital that you hold within the business is more valuable to the business at the end of the day. So thank you so much today, Igor, for this fascinating conversation, really about the human psyche and the future of people analytics. And I love, because I and Bobby talk about, well, people analytics is great. It's one thing to have the data, the metrics, but it's another to actually apply insights and actually come up and design action plans thereafter. So you can look at stare dashboards all day, but if those dashboards aren't going to tell you what you need to do. So thank you again so much for providing this side of the equation for a well-rounded, well-versed people analytics and HR departments as they move forward and find and settle into their new role within these businesses as that strategic business partner to really help organizations kind of propel their business forward in the new normal. So thank you from myself for being a part of the show, Igor. It was a blast.
Yeah, thank you very much. It was great speaking with you. So we don't usually reflect on this thing so over the day. So we do all the things in terms of research, but we don't usually take some time to think and reflect on the next step. So it was great speaking with you about this.
Beautiful. Well, thanks so much. And I can't wait to start applying some of your intellectual capital that you just gave me. So take it easy, Igor. You have a great day. Thanks so much.
Cheers. Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye.
Bye.